Channel Islands are way up the list compared to us.
Certainly.
So they've definitely got to address their approach to international cooperation.
So where have we excelled, where the Channel Islands, Gibraltar, etc. have fallen behind? Because there's some 10, even 20 places ahead of us in secrecy index terms.
Well, if you look at I've got, just as I'm talking to you, I've got the breakdown of the figures. This is available for listeners. This is available at just Google Financial Secrecy Index 2018, and you can get an individual report on all the countries. We get a pure score of absolute compliance on, for example, bilateral treaties. I mean, we have so many international relations that there isn't even a score for us on that. The higher your percentage, the less compliant you are. If you then look where they think we fall down, is that we don't make public, that is, to you and me and the man and woman in the street, ownership of private company accounts, the shareholdings and beneficial ownership of companies, limited partnerships and that sort of thing. Well, we've got one of the most advanced beneficial ownership registration regimes in the world, the new 2017 Act, which upgraded the old 2012 Act. And the only people who need that information are the police and the financial services authorities, and they have full access. So those red lines on our report, which without them we'd be even lower down the list, are really well explainable.
This is all seemingly part of a new way of thinking about tax and international cooperation, or lack of. I note just a quote from the TJN here, which says the definition of a tax haven has moved to be a rich OECD member country and their satellites. Now, we have long been regarded, both in of ourselves and by our peers, as big clients of the City of London, of US business. Is a slip down the list here indicative of us becoming less competitive?
I wondered that myself, but if you look, I don't think so. I think it's because I think we've gone down the list because of the things we've mentioned, as we've been talking today, that the Isle of Man's legislative regime, its compliance, its international cooperation is very, very sophisticated. I don't think it's an indication that one could say, for example, oh, well, Jersey and Guernsey are just as sophisticated, but they do 10 times more work, which is why they would be higher up the list. They have a bigger impact. No, I think it genuinely is that the government over the last 20 years here has so refined the compliance nature of our finance sector that we almost no longer featuring on the radar.
Well, I suppose the test there is the bombshells, as it were, we've endured over the last 18, 24 months. The Panama Papers 2 years ago now, and last year, of course, the Paradise Papers, which was last time we had you up in this very studio in the wake of that release. How have we fared out of that?
I think we fared well, but interestingly, involving the Tax Justice Network, they asked me if I would do a short piece to be included in the Financial Secrecy Index report on the Isle of Man. And I produced one saying the obvious, it's not a tax haven, and saying why. And they rejected it. They rejected it just after New Year. And they said, oh, no. In our view, and this is completely counterintuitive to their secrecy methodology, which is the only methodology they're supposed to operate. Oh, they said, because of that VAT business and the aircraft. Well, that's simply naive. We know that the VAT matter is under investigation. We don't know what the result is, but it certainly doesn't of itself indicate that the Isle of Man is a tax haven. So the impact of the Paradise Papers has been a certain superficiality that people just read the headline and then assume and make up and can't be bothered to go into the detail. We've got to be very careful, or our government has got to be very careful to counter those Chinese whispers that are going to get worse and worse and worse, because they are wholly wrong.
Can the Isle of Man still hold its own in an international community as secretive as this, while trying to move away from that very practice?
I think if you were to ask anybody in the finance sector here, banking, insurance, pensions, corporate service, trust service providers, whether they would be content taking instructions from somebody whose primary motivation was secrecy, I think you'll find well, not all perhaps, but the vast majority would say, no, we don't want that kind of business. Not because they're afraid of that kind of business, but because they don't need that kind of business. There are jurisdictions around the world where your structures, by structures I mean your companies, your partnerships and whatever, don't even have to be registered. I mean, let alone work out who owns them. You don't even have to declare they exist. We don't do that. So if somebody wants that level of secrecy, there are plenty of other places they can go to that don't touch us at all.
I suppose quite on the contrary, transparency is becoming something of an industry in itself.
Yes. There are two competing industries. One, as we have here, chiming in with the need for transparency. Basically, if what you're doing in business is something, apart from commercially sensitive information, which goes without saying anywhere, but if you're happy to go into the market square and say, yes, we're looking at this, this and this is what we do, that's us. If you're going for secrecy and concealment, then you would go to one of the countries where, for example, question, how many companies are registered in Liechtenstein? Answer, there's no register. We don't know.